All right, hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Breakthru-Technologies presentation. Thank you to our sponsor, Roger Green. And it's been an interesting couple days here in New York. We did a couple talks already last night with sort of an update on the Theraphi, where we concentrated more on what's some latest updates of the Theraphi, which I'll go through again today. And we'll do some of the little tricks we were doing last night. And but this particular talk's basically on the future of health and energy technologies, but we're also going to look at the past because in my opinion, I think there's a lot of things that we overlooked and science has kind of put on the little bit of blinders, and everybody sort of specialized over the years in their particular field of interest, and nobody is really a true polymath anymore, meaning that they're very eclectic and diverse in their fields of knowledge. In the universities today, we're kind of steered towards specializing in one particular thing. And I think that's been a real detriment to progress of technology, because when you go back to the late 1800s, well, you can go way back. It seems like the education system has kind of been dumbed down a lot since even like Renaissance times, when we kind of made this transition of the philosophers were sort of the original scientists, and the alchemists. I talk a lot about the history of alchemy and how people like Isaac Newton, for instance, although he was coming up with the theories of gravity and these kind of things, laws of motion, Newton was also a very spiritual man, and he did a lot of studies into a lot of esoteric philosophies, did a lot of alchemical experiments, and did searching for Bible codes and all these kind of things. But after he had passed away, his family kind of buried all that side of it, and all those papers kind of went missing for a long time. And it wasn't until recently that a lot of this stuff started to surface, when people were realizing that he was working on a lot of these kind of philosophical concepts as well. So it's part of the thing where science and religion, I guess, kind of took two different paths and separated. But nowadays that we're starting to catch up with what we've been talking about in quantum mechanics for a while, we're coming to this understanding that there's a lot more to the coin. There's two sides of the coin, I guess, that we've never really looked at. And science kind of glances over a lot of that, but there's a understanding now that we have to look beyond that. So we're looking back into what they were saying at the turn of the century, last century, with ether theory and these kind of concepts. So when I'm looking back to a lot of these characters in the past, I'm looking for the things that got swept under the carpet and that we kind of forgot about. And one of the topics that we're going to talk a bit about today is the concept of scalar fields or scalar waves. And so we'll go through a little bit of that today. So these two topics have basically been my areas of interest, health and energy, because I think it's the two main topics that we really need as humanity. Obviously, the health is an important part of it, and with some of the technologies that are coming out in the health arena right now, we're starting to realize that we are definitely going to be able to live much longer, healthier lives. And we were just at the RADFest in San Diego this year with some of the top scientists working on longevity advancements in all kinds of medicine. And I think a lot of them are kind of going down with the blinders on in certain ways, where they want to do gene therapy, where they can custom print a slice of genetic code and put that into viruses and inject the viruses into your body and start replacing genes in your body. Like, it's getting this far. And I don't think we really need to go that far, but it's just one example. of how we can sort of look backwards in time, because if you look back into the Bible, you know, they said when they're going through the lists of people in the beginning in the book of Genesis and how long they lived, and they said, oh, they lived, so-and-so lived for 250 years and 300 years. And I do think that it was very likely that we had some very long lives in some of these people. And so with today's technology, once we start to realize how we can treat the body properly instead of abusing it by going along with nature instead of going against nature, we're going to be able to extend our lives. And they were talking at the conference, you know, about extending our lives to be 120 to 150 years old within the next 10, 15 years. So I think that's a possibility. But what we got to realize if we're going to do that is that we need to have a better energy systems, because right now we just exploit all our resources. And what we've been doing to the planet has obviously been pretty messy, and we have a lot of environmental problems right now with pollution. But I think with the proper technologies, when we look at things the way the ancient philosophers were, or even the early scientists, the turn of the last century, we'll be able to clean up a lot of the mess that we've made and create sustainable energy solutions. So those are my two main areas of interest. And I think a common term that's coming about through all of this is biomimicry. So I've always considered myself a philosopher of nature. One of my heroes basically was Victor Schauberger, and you know, he said that he learned from nature by studying nature, observing nature, and I think that's a big part of it. It's what the alchemists were doing as well. They were looking at nature and how nature worked, and instead of going against nature as we do with we talk about entropy and things like the internal combustion engine is a really good example of a real waste of energy, especially fossil fuels. And in my opinion, it's just totally ludicrous that we're still driving around with these oil-burning machines. I think oil and gas will always have its place. We'll always make plastics and things like that out of it, but to be using it for transportation fuels is kind of ridiculous. So looking at some energy solutions to replace the way we use energy is really important, as well as being able to recycle the waste products that we make from that. If you look at the consumption of petrochemicals alone, I mean, the amount of exhaust coming out of your exhaust pipe has enough energy in it to be able to drive your car in the first place. But instead of using the combustion engine, which is like 30% efficient at tops, and a lot of that fuel gets burnt off in your catalytic converter, where they have a catalyst in there just to clean up the emissions. And it's a big part of it's also with this carbon capture thing. The idea is not to try and capture the carbon after we've already made the emissions. It's to not be emitted in the first place. And I don't really think that the carbon is such a big issue as what we're being led to believe either. So we'll look a little bit later on about waste to energy. But I think this is a good area that we can start with, because A, it's going to clean up some of the mess we've made and the pollution, as well as creating energy from it. And then nature has always been, you know, very efficient. It doesn't leave any waste. Nature doesn't make any waste. Everything kind of works together. The bees are a really good example in this case in efficiency. When you look at just the honeycomb, you know, inside the hive, in the dark, they manage to make this master design of these hexagonal cells that uses the most efficient use of space. Very strong structure. So just by watching nature, I think that's how we're going to create new technologies that are going to be more beneficial for mankind. So you've probably seen some of my talks where I talk about some of these characters in history, and these have been some inspirational people for me. Royal Raymond Rife, of course Nikola Tesla, Walter Russell, Michael Faraday, James Clerk Maxwell, and a modern character we have in for a change is Eric Dollard, because Eric's name has come up quite a bit in recent discussions, and I've been down to the energy conference there with Aaron and Eric, and we had a chance to talk to him a few times, and he's quite an amazing guy. I've been following him from back in the Borderland Science days, and I think he's a character that is going to understands a lot of the problems mathematically and in electrical engineering sense that we need to really have a close look at, instead of denying things like this scalar wave concepts and stuff like that we'll talk about today. And that's one of the terms that gets used in when we talk about the Theraphi. And what the Theraphi has shown to be able to do is create this bioactive field that's had quite a lot of benefits for many people. As we've put this sort of experiment out there about 3 years ago, there's over 100 Theraphis in 20 different countries now around the world, and we get a lot of reports from the clinics and people who are working with it. And personally, I've been just amazed with some of the results. And so we'll talk a little bit about how the Theraphi works and what it's doing. And basically, the body runs on electricity. So everything is when it comes down to, you get down to the core fundamentals of biology, physics, and chemistry, it's all about charge. And we live in an electric universe. This is all purely electrical phenomenon. And how we can use electricity to influence the body with these bioactive fields has been quite an interesting study, and it's been a core part of my work over the years. Everything in nature also moves in spirals. Nothing goes in a straight line, all the way from subatomic particles up to macrocosmic scale, and looking at galaxies and our solar system and everything. Everything is spinning and everything's in motion. And nothing is ever at rest, and nothing's ever moving in a straight line. So we use these ideas of these conical sort of waveguides that the plasma tubes are, to create these spin fields. And in Russia, it's been called spintronics or torsion fields. So a lot of these ideas have, modern electrical theory has kind of ignored this idea of the twist, or even, as John was saying this morning, in Einstein, when we were looking at Einstein's theories, they're all based on sort of a planar that you can stretch time or stretching space, but nothing takes into consideration the spin. And angular momentum has been a big part of understanding. We talk about things like transmutation and being able to shift elements on the periodic table and things like that, and looking at atomic the spin down at atomic and subatomic levels is a really important part of a missing piece in the science, if you will. So these spin fields are a big part of what's happening with the Theraphi. In the tubes, they're counter-rotating vortices. And I'll show you a little video that has the tubes sort of slowed down, so you can see what's this might not be it. So you can see the spinning in the plasma itself. So they're designed as such that the each of the electrodes, now this is one of the older versions of the tubes with the internal electrodes. They're external now, inductively coupled. But each of these arms on the tubes is creating a spin in the plasma, and those three plasma spinning fields combine into a braid that spins within the entire tube. And so one tube, when you're in the field, is rotating clockwise and the other one's counterclockwise. And these twisting motions, especially when you have opposite pairs of twisting motion, have been a big part of spintronics. And we'll show you some mechanical devices that are doing some really interesting things here in a little bit. That gives you an idea of how the tubes are spinning. They're very fast when you look at them in real time, so it's hard to see that that's happening in there, but you can tweak it a little bit to slow it down, and that's how I shot that video. So this is one of Dan's slides. So Dan Winter basically came up with the algorithm based on Planck's length and Planck time combined with the phi ratio to produce the complex waveforms that are the main algorithm within the Theraphi that generates the frequencies. So it's a broad spectrum. The frequencies are from down to 0.3 hertz up into the kilohertz range, and it's a wide complex waveform that's being produced in there. And Dan's, classic vision of the pine cones kissing is what's happening, because we're causing this charge collapse in the potential that's happening between the two tubes. So the two tubes are 180 degrees out of phase, and right at the center they're basically canceling each other out. So when you have one side at plus 10 and the other side at minus 10, you add them together, there's a 0. So as you get closer to the center point, the sweet spot in between the tubes, you get this charge collapse into this key point in the center, and then this is where the scalar component comes in. And this is from Walter Russell's Universal One, and Walter Russell I've talked about in several videos, and really just had the intuition to come up with a lot of this stuff. And when he wrote this book and put it out there, he sent printed 1,000 copies, and he sent it to universities and academics and people of his time. He was a contemporary of Einstein and Tesla and all these guys, so everybody got one in all these universities and stuff, and most people just went over their head, or they didn't understand it, and only one person actually replied back to him in regards to it, and that was Tesla, who said, "Walter, you should take this book and bury it for 1,000 years, because humanity's not ready for this yet." So Tesla, even himself considered, said he was 100 years ahead of his time, and I think that, he may well be right. And what's really interesting is that a lot of people, and it's a lot of independent researchers who are coming up with this stuff and starting to look at these alternate theories and concepts and working with them and showing how these ideas are actually working. This is Walter's periodic table from the Universal One, and in that he shows everything sort of fitting into these waveforms and how all the harmonics are working in matter, and in all the elements in the periodic table being able to be laid out on them. Tom Bearden, we talk a lot about phase conjugation, and Tom Bearden talked a lot about that, so we took a lot of concepts from how Tom was explaining these things, and basically he was talking a lot about interferometry and interference zones in these wave patterns, and basically that's what's being created within the two tubes. So picture the tubes as each being a transmitter, and it's utilizing the longitudinal waves that are coming out of the Theraphi, because the plasmas are really good. You can produce all kinds of different waves inside of plasma, and it's really good at doing the longitudinal waves. John, could you grab the tubes from remember where we got them from yesterday? Yeah?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? Can you pop one out? And I'll do that demonstration again. So these wave interference patterns, especially when you can create them, so here on the top is just a transverse wave interference pattern. And when you can do that with the longitudinal waves, which is what we're utilizing with the Theraphi, we can create this phase conjugation quite easily with this thing. So as you're laying on the table, you become part of the circuit. So your body is acting like a capacitor and also as like the phase conjugate mirror, and the varying densities in your tissue and the various frequency components to your body, like the different rhythms of the heart and your brain, and that are providing the pump wave that Bairden talked about. He also was a lieutenant colonel, and he talked about the weaponization using these scalar waves and longitudinal interferometry. So if you had enough power and you focus those waves enough that you could concentrate them into a very small point, you know, anything can be used for good or bad. You can build a house with a hammer, or you can whack somebody on the head with it. And it's sort of human nature to find out how to use it for destructive purposes. So unfortunately, some of these things have been, but they can also be very powerful constructive devices like the Theraphi here. So here's just a summary of some of the waves that can be created within plasma, and we'll look at some of the longitudinal waves that are actually visible with these tubes. So I can do it while she's on there. But when you get close to this, of course, you know, Tesla talked about wireless energy transmission and things like this. And because this whole device is creating an electrostatic field around it, it gets naturally, the energy gets induced in the plasma, and it converts it from the electrostatic field into something that you can see to believe it's there. A lot of people used to say, oh, there's nothing going on in between there, you're not being exposed, those are just lights that are, you know, pretty lights that have something to do with it. So to prove them that there is something going on in the field, you know, you can just take the coil, the tube, and you can see it. So here inside the tube, you see the longitudinal waves actually moving. So my hand is being part of the field. Whenever anything is within the field, the waves are conforming to it, and that's why we don't put large metal objects into the field, because the metal objects will accumulate the charge on the surface, and they'll actually charge up, and you can see a voltage potential, and you can convert that to real power quite easily. So the metal will distort the field, and you can see as well with the coil in the bottom. So there's a null point right at the center of the coil. So the same null point that's happening on the table inside is being emulated in the coil. So you're not directly part of the circuit, you're part of the secondary circuit that's sort of inductively coupled to the coil, and it has this null zone. But as you move to each end, you can see the potentials on each end. So to get a good idea of the longitudinal waves, it's really easy to be able to see them within the tubes like that. And then, so right in the middle, which, you know, if she wasn't on there, I could put this in the center of the table, and I'll show you when she's done. The two longitudinal waves are moving towards each other, and they basically converge right at your Dan chin, and that's where we have the charge collapse. And that's when the scalar field is emanated from that charge collapse. Because where does all that energy go when it cancels out at the center point? And so we've been playing with shape. The other way of creating these kind of things is with shapes and geometries. And we've taken metal and put it in the field purposely to expand the field in here. And we've had some really interesting results lately with some of the pyramid kits we're building with stainless steel. You can see at pyramidkits.net-kits. And basically it comes as a kit, and you can add your pieces in the middle, and you can either make the whole pyramid out of square boxed stainless steel, or you can add copper into the center for a nice effect. Originally we were making with copper, but the nodes were a bit weak. When you're really stressed on them, they would break, but the stainless steel is really strong. So now when you put a pyramid within the field, of course the metal is taking on part of the charge, and the energy, the electrostatic field, is conforming to the natural vortex that exists in the pyramid shape alone. And we've had some really interesting experiences with people sitting in here with inside of the pyramid. Almost like spiritual experiences. People that aren't very religious or spiritual at all are suddenly communicating with angels and things like that. So we're going to have some reports for you real soon on what's going on there, but it's pretty wild. And of course, everybody has a unique experience in it. And of course, the pyramids just look really pretty if you want to put one in your garden or something like that. Now, the Russians have experimented with placing these things in agricultural areas, and they found that they had an increase in crop yields. They've put water inside of the pyramid and used the water for medicinal type purposes. They did one study where they had these premature babies who had like a 5% survival rate basically in them, and they took a study group and they took some of them and were giving them 1 cc of the water that had been charged for 72 hours in the pyramid, and they had a 100% success rate. They're giving them 1 cc a day. So the water has some really unusual properties, and that's just being in the pyramid alone. So the pyramid being, based on having the bottom on the ground and the tip up in the air, is a geometric equivalent of an asymmetrical capacitor, which is also what Tesla coil is doing. And this is one way of creating this scalar type field effects. And people have sent in, different reports and stuff. We've been collecting data on how they're using the Theraphi and what's happening. And sometimes just some strange anomalies pop up, like Kirsten in Boston. She had some dried flowers in the next room on the other side of the wall, about 12 feet away from the Theraphi when she first got it. And they had been dried out for a while, and suddenly new growth started coming out of the roses. So she sent in these flowers with the new little branches on them shortly after she started running the Theraphi in the room. So that was kind of interesting. So this is one of the latest developments that's basically an add-on to the Theraphi. It's called the AQUA-PHI. And it consists basically of a 45-gallon barrel drum that has the coil strapped on the side. And basically you unplug the tubes and you plug in, on one side you have the stainless steel round sink, and then you have a toroidal top load, which you normally see on top of a Tesla coil. Acts as a capacitor, so the charge can spread out over the surface and maintain a higher charge and capacitance for the coil. And then a golden mean spiral of copper wire down the center. And so that when the plasma discharges from the voltage potential, in the coil, interesting things happen, especially when the water is vortexing. You can do it on the still surface of the water, but adding the SCHAUBERGER kind of component too, everything's better when it spins, and that's what water likes to do. So we been running it in these vortexes, and interestingly enough, the pH drops considerably in a short period of time after running it. And there's been a few papers come out recently on what they're calling plasma activated water. And basically what's happening when you see the corona at the end of the tip there, the corona is really ionization of the nitrogen in the air. That's where you're getting the wavelength of that nice violet color coming out. So what's happening is the nitrogen seems to be getting fixed into the water, and it's creating basically like nitric acid in the water, lowering the pH. But there's a few other interesting things that are in the water now. One of them is nitrogen dioxide, which is fairly toxic for humans, so don't drink this water. But when you water your plants with it, they just kind of go ballistic. And it's also fixing different nitrates in the water, so considering for the plant growth. So we're really doing three things with the water, with the Theraphi. We're imprinting the frequencies, of course, that it's being driven with into the water, as well as charging the water, as well as taking the nitrogen and creating these nitrates within the water itself. So we just started doing, it's still in its prototype stage, and we're just starting doing some tests with that, so we'll hopefully have some results fairly soon. So part of the inspiration for the Theraphi, of course, comes from Royal Raymond Rife, and a lot of people ask, you know, what's the difference between the Theraphi and a Rife machine? And there's a number of differences. What Rife was doing was creating plasma, of course, inside of a single tube. All the Rife machines have basically been using a single tube. The Theraphi is the first device to use this phase conjugated array in these tubes like this. There's been a few handheld ones that use plasma tubes, but to my knowledge it hadn't been done before. So originally what I had always envisioned, I'd been building Rife machines for many years, and I always wanted to make a tube big enough like Anton Perori was doing, but I wanted to make it so you could actually get into it like an MRI machine, because I knew that the sweet spot was right at the center of the anode and the cathode inside of the tube, right? And that's where the emissions are coming from. So people have had great success with standard Rife tubes over the years. But one of the main differences is that Rife was concentrating on finding the mortal oscillating rate of various different pathogens like viruses and bacteria and being able to hit them with a harmonic that basically overpowered it and shattered it like an opera singer with a wine glass. And so I consider Rife type machines to be destructive devices that are killing various pathogens, whereas the Theraphi is a constructive device, because the frequencies that are in the Theraphi are based on nature, namely golden mean and Planck's length. And the way the field's propagated with the phase conjugated array, that the body is basically absorbing this energy because the body's like a sponge. So one of the names I have for it is the human battery charger. And really I see it as giving the body enough potential to do what it does, and does it more efficiently. And so when you look at what we started doing with the Rife machines in the early days was actually taking small life forms like this Plepharisma, and you put it on a slide, and you know, these things are highly modal and they zip around like this, and you can't catch them in the microscope because they're zipping around like this. And then you turn on your Rife machine sitting a couple feet away from the slide, and you tune it until you hit the resonant frequency of this guy, And then all of a sudden you'll see him stop, and he's kind of like shaking and moving around, and then you see the cell wall start to pulsate like this, and you know you're hitting the frequency, and then all of a sudden, boom, it explodes, and the contents of the cell spill out. So Victor Schauberger, again, you know, went back to the AQUA-PHI and the vortexes. He understood just by, you know, watching how water flows in nature, how many of these processes work. And when you look at a stream, you know, one of the things we do is as humans is we try to curve nature away from what it wants to naturally do to make it do what we want it to do. For instance, if we build a canal, we'll just make like concrete walls and make a straight line from where we want the water to come from to where we want it to go. And this is totally inefficient and not the way the water wants to move. And what Schauberger showed is the reason why streams meander and they're continuously changing and shifting. And when you look overhead at an aerial photo of the stream, you see it goes like this. Well, what's happening is the water is vortexing in one direction around one curve, and then it reaches that nice sweet spot in the center where what he calls this energy cannon exists. So again, think of the two opposing spin fields, and then switches and goes the opposite direction to form the curve in the other way. So the Theraphi is a good example of utilizing what just naturally happens in nature to incorporate into technology. And Schauberger was a master at that, and some of the things he looked at also were fish and how fish swim, and he wanted to try and figure out, well, why could fish swim upstream faster than they swim downstream? They're going against the current, shouldn't it be harder? But you know, he showed through pictures like this is as the fish moved, they created these eddy currents behind them that were actually pushing them forward. So the more the stream was flowing head on, they had more energy to move forward. And when you look at how the scales of a fish are laid out, they're like little shingles on there, so the water can move smoothly in one direction, but catches on the other side. So as the water's passing by it, it's creating a little vortice behind it and actually pushing the fish forward. And this is how fish, you can see salmon jumping up waterfalls and how they find these harmonic skips in the water and then build enough energy potential behind them through taking advantage of these natural energies, and you'll see them skip in sort of patterns going up these waterfalls where they can actually climb quite high. So there's been some really good water technologies come out recently, and this one here I think is pretty exciting. It's a gravitation water vortex power plant. So instead of just using, you know, a standard paddle wheel type turbine, these guys in Germany have created this gravitation water vortex power plant where they're spinning a turbine with a vortex, and all you have to do is simply get the water going. And again, this becomes a fish-friendly power generation system. A lot of problems with the turbines, they had to build separate fish ladders around the side of them wherever they make dams to get the fish to be able to go through without getting chewed up in the turbines, and perhaps some of them still go through the turbines, and it's probably not so pretty. But the advantage of these is they only have to have a drop of less than a meter. So usually you want a high head on the top of your water in order to spin a turbine, and to get enough power you have to have more head on it. So the water has to fall a lot farther. Conventional systems need at least a few meters ahead to produce 1,000 watts of power, whereas this generator produces a lot of power with only less than a meter of a drop, and it's all done within a vortex. And so you can see their sort of impeller on here on the turbine. And another design that's come out in the last few years, well, here's some of the examples of how much power they've been producing since they came up with this in 2006. So on this particular one, the head's only a meter and a half, and they're producing 8.3 kilowatts of power. So over the year, they're producing 55,000 kilowatts of power, which is pretty good. It only cost them 60,000 euros to build it, so most of the cost is in the cement. But they also point out, the energy available combined from the wind, sun, biomass, geothermal, and water compared to our worldwide consumption. And it's probably much bigger than that because, if you had a small surface area and you were able to have some of the modern super efficient solar cells that aren't quite ready for humans or for standard market yet for some reason, we could be producing a lot of energy from the sun. So the combination of coal, oil, and gas and uranium, that's just a one-shot burn in comparison, but this green dot is probably much higher. And really, in my opinion, when people talk about free energy and stuff like that, and they talk about the second law of thermodynamics and all this, and I say, well, look, it's as simple as this. We live in an infinite sea of energy. There's nothing but energy, and somebody was just smart enough to put an electrical meter on your house and charge you for it. There's many ways that we'll be able to do, and yeah, we have problems with solar and wind the way we're doing it now, but hopefully within the next few years we're going to find some decent ways, and looking at this biomimicry and utilizing the way nature does it, I think is a good start, somewhere we can start with a solid foundation on these ideas. This particular shape is called a lily impeller, basically, from Pax Water. I think they're out of Australia. And so they're creating these huge vortexes. Now they're using this to move water, like with a pump, but I think this would be a good combination to combine with the German technology. So instead of using a crude turbine like they have in their water, you should be able to put one of these lily impellers right at the heart of the vortex and convert the energy the other way. But again, this is all designed, they call it the lily impeller because it unfolds like a lily, and they experimented using golden mean and using the way nature works to create this thing. And these little guys are capable of moving a lot of water. And they're it can be easily made. You can 3D print them or make them out of all kinds of other materials. But if you're just doing prototypes, that's one of the beauties of 3D printing, is you can quickly whip out an idea and give it a test in a soft test case scenario. So that's what they've been working on, and they found that they could move a lot of water using very little energy. In big water towers and things like this, they keep the water circulating so it doesn't go stagnant. And so one of the typical things that they'll have inside of them when they have a large body of water that they need to move in big vortexes like this is having a big, huge motor with a propeller type design similar to, you got to think in 2 dimensions. We do a lot of things not thinking in 3 dimensions. The airfoil and the wings on windmills and wings on airplanes and things like this is more a 2-dimensional concept, and what they did with the lily pump is considering the 3rd dimension. And so you can scale it down from this big, huge machine to circulate the water. This little lily impeller on here with a teeny little motor on it can move the same amount of water that they've been using traditionally with this guy. So it gets pretty amazing. Now, in researching a lot of these topics, I've come across these Calvin Abrams slides quite a bit, because one of the key things that we got to look at is geometry. And so that's how they did it with the lily impeller. They were looking at nature and looking at geometry and making things more efficient to this. So this fellows came up with this theory, I guess, of tetraionics, and it explains how all matter and forces stem from Planck's quanta, and he uses this triangle basically in a tetrahedron to come up with a lot of these concepts. And they're interesting. I haven't gotten into this stuff as much as I'd like to, but I've gone through a few of the slides, and it seems to be some pretty interesting concepts and ideas that he goes through. So just applying geometry to whatever problems you're facing is an important way to look for a solution. And of course, Tesla knew this, and he designed all his coils. One of his big, secrets was he always worked with certain numbers, everything 3s, 6s, and 9s, and multiples of 3s. And so when he stayed in his room down in New York or here, he would, check into the room that could be divisible by 3. When he sat down for dinner, he'd have 3 forks and 6 knives and 18 napkins or whatever. And he was a little bit eccentric that way, but he wound his coils, and that's part of the design in the Theraphi too. The coils are all based on 3, 6s, and 9s, and incorporating, of course, the phi ratio in there. So Einstein was once asked, how it felt to be the smartest man alive, and he said, "I don't know, you'll have to ask Nikola Tesla." So I think that was pretty good. And Tesla was great for coming up with a lot of quotes too, and this is a good one. "To know each other, we must reach beyond the sphere of our sense perceptions." And that's just it. We're very limited. Everything that we look at and want to say is truth, because this is what science is really all about, is categorizing, classifying, and coming up with what is true through our observations of nature. But we've been limited by our senses, because things like when we talk about scalar waves and these fields, just defining a field is a difficult thing for most physicists, and it really comes down to that, if we can't see it or smell it, taste it, touch it, then doesn't exist. And so part of the limitations of electronics is we've never been able to measure or quantify any of these fields. And so this is where Tesla was getting at. And then we start to see how everything is so interconnected, and how we're all interconnected. And that's been a big part of the process in building the Theraphi, and we've purposely done that with our intentions. And Kelly talks about this quite a bit, is the consciousness, and how it's creating this conscious sort of field. And the alchemists said for years that consciousness is everywhere. It's in everything. So everything has a consciousness. Something like a rock that lives for millions and millions of years just lives in sort of a longer time domain, slower time domain, but they live, they're born, they come out of a volcano, they get eaten by fungi and bacteria, break them down, become minerals, and then get reconsumed. So life just feeds on life, and everything is in this perpetual cycle. So part of the concept with what we've been doing with the Theraphi is in the realization of that. And it's purposely been programmed into the intention of the device to be able to work in this way. And of course, Tesla had all kinds of patents and created a lot of amazing things over the years. And when we look at his Tesla coil, it's kind of ironic that the only modern use that we've found for this thing is just to make big sparks and go, yeah, wow, it's cool, it's an entertainment value. But not too many people have found practical applications for them. I mean, we put coils in the Model T Ford and created an ignition coil based on this design to run the internal combustion engine. but there really hasn't been a lot of development because we haven't looked at these properties like the scalar concept to be able to utilize it. So, I mean, it's all fun to make big sparks, and it provides a lot of entertainment value, but I find it's kind of ironic that that's what we're doing with these coils. But at the same time, it's part of the conscious evolution. I mean, when I grew up, when I was a kid, I had to really dig for information about Tesla. You know, he was completely buried. Everybody knew everything about Thomas Edison, and he created the light bulb and all this, but there wasn't a word about Nikola Tesla. And so when we have to dig in and find out what he was doing and where he was going with a lot of this stuff to understand. And yeah, Tesla was a showman too. And, you know, he's basically doing the same trick here with these tubes. And he would make his own tubes and had single wire transmission. So you can do that with a Tesla coil. You can take a single wire and have it running up along the perimeter of here. And his workshop was all lit up with various different gas tubes on a single wire. I've experimented a lot with single wire transmission and these things as well. This is a great photo where everybody sort of gathered together to go and tour Marconi's lab in New Jersey. And you see a lot of interesting people that attended, including in the center of the photo here, Albert Einstein, Nikola Tesla, and Steinmetz. And so there was a lot of excitement, and all these guys were kind of going in this direction to try and understand. You know, they had this concept of the ether theory, and they had the concept of electrostatic fields, and a lot of the alternative things that sort of gotten written out of electrical theory, or at least dumbed down, and Maxwell's equations being simplified by Oliver Heaviside and things like that. And what Tesla was getting at that everybody likes to talk about is this idea of so-called free energy. It was more just a way of utilizing the transfer of energy, because, you know, Tesla was basically using the model of the Earth as being one basically electrode in the system, and the atmosphere being the other. And there's a huge potential, as we know, just by looking at the sky at night, especially up in the north, you'll see the aurora borealis. And so as the sun is emitting, especially when there's large solar flares, the poles of our planet light up like light bulbs, very much like the Theraphi again. When we look at the fields around the Earth, and we have a North Pole and a South Pole, and these vortices that converge at the ends of the poles, and then we have the center sweet spot around the equator on the Earth. So the Earth's like a huge dynamo that is just swimming in a sea of energy, and we see similar spins. We noted that when you go up into the atmosphere, as you go up to the atmosphere, there's different currents of electricity, much like water moves around the Earth in these rivers through the air. The energy does as well, and it vortexes, as well as in magnetic fields. The magnetic fields are in vortexes. But we look at that standard picture that you see of a magnet, and they just show those flux lines that go like this. But they don't really. They twist, and they come out from the poles in vortex motions, and what we call the blotch wall in the center of the magnet is really like the dielectric an inertial plane that is sort of like the center null spot in the center of the coil here. So, well, a lot of people, you know, argued back and forth about what part it is that creates the scalar waves from a Tesla coil. Some people say, well, it's in the secondary, and some people say, well, it's in the primary, or it's in the capacitor. And you can definitely look at a capacitor as being with a scalar potential within it. And basically what it is it's a stress on the ether. So I'll use the ether term to look at it this way, but it's a stress on time and space is what this scalar field is. And the way the Tesla coil is really doing it is the Tesla coil is basically, so you see how it has a ground plane, and one end of the coil's tied to the ground and the other is elevated in the air. Well, the Earth is quite large, and you create quite a big plane on one side of the coil, and then you have your top load, your capacitor, like that toroid on the AQUA-PHI on top. And really what it is it becomes an asymmetrical capacitor. And so that scalar potential is created within the field around the whole coil, with the top load being one side and the ground being the other. And so near the end of Tesla's days, he kind of got, he kind of got reclusive, and some people came by to visit him at various different points. And after he passed away, there's a lot of rumors of how he was involved in certain projects, from the Philadelphia experiment to all these other kind of things. And the biggest thing that the government was kind of concerned with, if they weren't working with him in these projects, was the rumors that he had developed some kind of scalar weapon, and he had some kind of ray gun or some kind of way of weaponizing these scalar fields. And most likely this has been put into place, some of the technology that maybe he came up with or his ideas evolved into. We can see this in modern day phenomenon when they fire up different antennas, like the HARPS project, using a large array of delta T antennas, and are able to bend the upper ionosphere into various shapes. And I've seen a lot of these patterns. You see them as checkerboard patterns in the sky, or this one in particular is quite interesting. I don't know if it's a real photo or not. I just kind of found it on the internet, but the same kind of concept. So we've been using these kind of technologies to basically create a lensing effect in the atmosphere. And one of the ideas is that, of course, this has been weaponized, and you've heard about weather warfare. You can control the weather. Weird things happen with the animals, like the migration patterns of birds and whales washing up on beaches because they're using these technologies in the oceans for communication and things like that. So you can see it. And last year, the CIA actually declassified a lot of documents. I was kind of hoping that they'd have actual documents of Tesla that they do, and I haven't gone through them all yet, but some interesting things came out. And one of these subjects of one of these documents was scalar waves. And so this is declassified by the CIA. You can find it on their website. And so, the whole argument of these scalar waves don't exist, that's just all made up by somebody. Well, why would the CIA be interested in it, and why are they asking somebody to give them a summary of what Tesla knew about scalar waves? And so you read this document, it says, per reference, the writer will provide a summary below of his understanding, meaning Tesla's, of the nature of scalar waves. These are unconventional waves that are not necessarily a contradiction to Maxwell's equations, as some have suggested, but might be represented to an extension of Maxwell's understanding at that time. If realizable, a scalar wave could represent a new form of wave propagation that could penetrate seawater, resulting in a new method of submarine communication and possibly a new form of technology for ASW. Thus, the potential applications are of a high interest to the U.S. R&D community and the intelligence community, particularly if some promise is shown to their realizability. So you can see even back then these guys were really keen on it, and the argument is that a lot of these things evolved into some of these technologies like the HARPS project. And in this particular short document, they do get into there, and interestingly enough, they mentioned Tom Bearden in one of these documents, and meetings with the IEEE where they openly discussed these concepts of Tesla's waves. No, it might not be in these documents where they mention Bearden, but later on I have some other documents where Bearden would do briefings with the military meetings with these guys quite often on this scalar and longitudinal waves. So the scalar wave, as the writer understands, is not an electromagnetic wave. An electromagnetic or EM wave has both electric fields and magnetic fields, B fields, and power flow in EM waves is by means of basically a vector, pollinating vector as follows, and they go through some of the things. And so they sum up in here that from paragraph 4, there's a suggestion to a solution to Maxwell's equations involving a scalar wave potential S that can propagate without the vector of the electromagnetic flow. So interesting stuff. At the end they say if such scalar waves exist, then they will be transformed via collective phenomena from microscopic waves to macroscopic waves, as in the case of Josephson junction theory, Cooper pair, electron pairs. They will also behave like longitudinal waves in plasma and grow via propagation on a non-optical branch of the WK space. They will result from collective phenomenon, as in plasma waves, grow via energy supplied by the medium, free space, seawater, etc. So what they're saying is that these waves can propagate through these things and could potentially be amplified. And everything can be a medium. There's nothing that can shield these things. So you can't block them with a Faraday cage and so on. And interestingly enough, the current president of the United States' uncle happens to be John G. Trump, who's reported to be one of the fellows who went into Einstein's or Tesla's vault, and they say it was a vault, and they showed as a safe in his room and stuff like this, but it was really a storage locker that he had somewhere in New York right nearby. And so Donald Trump's uncle was obviously, he was a military guy. He started out in the medical with x-rays and stuff like this, and was very interested in these type of technologies, and moved into the military and became an expert in radio transmissions and weaponry involving these type of things. So a little interesting side note in all this. So you can Google these and go to the CIA's website and download them if you are willing to do that. Some of the ways we've created these scalar waves have been interesting. So you know how I was saying that basically the fields are canceling each other out. This is a caduceus coil around a ferrite core, and if you notice that it's not wound like a traditional coil would be in a linear fashion, it actually folds in on itself. So the caduceus coil is one of the models that we kind of talk about scalar waves working with, and Dan has his funny slide with the basically the medical symbol with the caduceus pointing at each other, and the little caption says, yeah, but they don't know what their own symbol is really used for. This is another concept on how I was talking about causing this pressure wave and altering the time-space through pressure on the ether being done through a capacitor. This is sort of a capacitive wave of doing it. Now, I'm telling you that it's probably more likely that it's based around between the ground and the top of the Tesla coil. But this would definitely be one way of doing it, especially if you were to change the plates to different materials, and it's a way of stressing the dielectric or the air in between the plates. And you can also, there's a lot of really neat coils. One of the newer coils that sort of came out a bit was started off with, I guess, Marco Rodin, if you've seen the Rodin coils, and people started winding coils in different ways, and then people started making, after Marco came out with the Rodin coil, people started winding what they call the star mother coils, where they take these points and connect them like the old string art things, and you can produce very interesting fields with these. But one of the tricks, if you want to be able to utilize these scalar potentials, is to make the coils fold in on themselves. And this is sort of a basic particular example, because you can see the coil actually folds in on it. So you've got two counter-rotating fields. So this is when we get into the spintronics and the torsion concepts of how to be able to do it. This is the basic schematic for a Tesla coil. So the scalar potential can be considered, as I'm saying, through this thing. And this is just my idea on it. I'm not sure if it would be a good discussion to have with Eric Dollard. Actually, I asked Eric one time, I said, well, what is a scalar wave? And, you know, he kind of gave me a interesting answer. He said, well, you know, it's just like having two people observing the same thing at two different places and points in time, and therefore a scalar. So it's worth a better discussion, because I know they used to talk about a lot with the borderlands and stuff like that in the early days, but I think, you know, I've heard Eric in one of his last talks, where we'll show you where he's building a recreation of the Theraphi device, and, you know, he was bantering on about, you know, people abuse the word scalar, because every New Age conference you go to, somebody has a scalar, something or other, a pendant or whatever, and how does that relate to any of this, and how these terms get used. So part about the longitudinal wave interference from Berden. And so recently an interesting thing popped up in this field towards near Waco, Texas in the last little while. And these people were driving by and they're looking at this thing and they're like, geez, that looks a heck of a lot like a giant Tesla tower, or like a Marx generator, or Krakow-Walton going up there. You've seen probably some of those pictures on the internet in Russia where they have these massive generators and big huge tiles. So what's this doing in this wheat field in the middle of Texas? So they started looking into it, and it turns out that there's this company that's formed who owns the property there, called Breakthru-Technologies, and I might have the website on there. But if you type Visiv Tesla or Visiv Technologies, you'll come up with the website. And so what they're saying here and what they're doing is they actually really did recreate what Tesla's trying to do with his wireless power transmission. And they have plans. These are a lot of top brass military scientists who are been working on these things for many years. And they get into a little bit of detail on the website, and if you start to take some of the key words that they're talking about and research them, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. So they're talking about surface wave technologies as transmitting power and signals, being able to communicate in different ways than we've been doing with RF transmission. They've got all this commercialization and patents. They've got 100 plus patents, 760 patent pendings, 65 patents granted, U.S. and international already. And what they talk about is these Zenek waves that they're using for these surface waves, and these Zenek waves propagate over surfaces. It's maybe a part how, when I was saying how metallic objects charge up in the field, has a link to this. And these xenic waves, and this is just off Wikipedia, how they're related to plasmons, surface plasmons, and wireless energy transmission. So there's some interesting things going on in, with what Tesla had started even today. So hopefully something interesting will come from that. Fusion energy. I talk a lot about cold fusion in some of my other talks, and talk a little bit about it today. But I wanted to just throw in an update on what's going on with fusion in general, because fusion is sort of the opposite of fission. So nuclear fission, we're splitting atoms, much like nuclear bombs, to create energy. We can create vast amounts of energy, but vast amounts of energy are also created when you combine atoms together, and that's what fusion is. So one of the hopes is that this is going to be a cleaner energy, and it's not as destructive. So it's kind of like the concept of Rife machine versus Theraphi. Destructive powers are breaking apart atomic matter that sends ripples out into the cosmos, and they're detectable, for all around the Earth. It's no secret when you launch a nuclear bomb in any country around the planet, it's detectable, and probably detectable outside of our solar system. But what we've spent billions and billions of dollars in trying to do, and this is why the cold fusion debacle happened, is because we have been spending billions and billions of dollars to try and produce energy from fusion. And so this General Fusion is a Canadian company right in my backyard in Surrey, BC. What they're doing is kind of a different approach. So there's been several ways of achieving this fusion. And the most popular out there is the tokamak reactor, but General Fusion has a different way of going about it. And what they're doing is really interesting. It's a magnetized target fusion system. It has a plasma injector that supplies the fuels, and it has an array of pistons. And so these pistons are all around the central area, because part of the thing about creating the fusion, and it's not so hard to do that, and we've seen how it's done in the cold fusion in the past, but when you're producing a hot fusion, you end up with these incredibly high temperatures, and that's what they're doing, is taking that temperature and boiling water or whatever to create steam, to create the energy. And these guys have a fairly unique way of doing it, where they have sort of these liquid metal, molten metal pistons that compress the fuel into the center to confine the fusion process. So in a tokamak reactor that we'll look at in a second here, they're trying to do a magnetic confinement, and it takes tons and tons of energy to do it. And in all these processes, it takes a lot of energy. So this is their plasma injector, and you can see it all concentrates into this and then goes into their main reactor on the other side of the wall. And then they have these huge liquid metal pistons that basically compress it, and I'm guessing that they heat the metal and keep it in the liquid metal state to transfer the energy, which is kind of neat. Some of these huge pistons, and you can go online and look at what they're doing in General Fusion. And then of course they'll spin standard turbines to produce the electricity. And so just last month, the Canadian government gave them $49.3 million towards their venture. So there's your carbon credit dollars going to something that. But the thing is, the big argument about the hot fusion is, people have said they spent billions and billions and billions of dollars over the years on massive projects like this to be able to do it. These guys have a really unique approach, so we're going to see where it goes. But the standard model that we've been using to do this has been with this tokamak reactor. So tokamak is basically a big toroid. It's a big donut. And the idea is to inject your material that you want to fuse together in there. We use like deuterium and tritium, because It has the extra protons that are a little bit easier to crash together. So this ITER project is a really interesting one. That's another multi-billion-dollar project that's being built in South France right now. And you don't really hear much of it on the news. When they started this out, I had to kind of dig around to really get some information on it. But they have a pretty nice website now, and they're actually disclosing a lot of the things they're doing. And interestingly enough, it's a joint venture project between China, India, Japan, Korea, Russia, and the US. And they've already built similar smaller reactors in Russia with Russia and China joint projects. So it's pronounced ITER. So they're claiming that they'll have unlimited energy, and this has been the whole thing about fusion, is that they want to be able to create this unlimited energy and have clean power and not create so much nuclear waste. One of the things about fission nuclear reactors that we've had in the past is when you get down to do the nitty-gritty and you look at the math and how much it takes to do it, the profits really come from making nuclear materials for weapons like high-grade plutonium and things like this, rather than producing energy. So producing the energy has always been a cover sort of mask for these projects. So it'll be interesting to see what's going to come of this. So yeah, here they're fusing deuterium, the 2H and the 3H tritium together to form helium-4. And this you can go online and read about it, but they tell the usual story about the sun and everything like this. But this project's absolutely massive, and this is the model. It's going to be the biggest tokamak reactor ever built, and they got some incredible photos that they do. And they started it in 2013, I think, but it's a huge project. And they employ something like 30,000 people around the world. This is the foundation for the center of the reactor. I mean, if one thing, mankind has just been incredibly amazing in some of the things that we can build nowadays. So it's really, from an engineering perspective, these are sort of little goodies to look at some of these things. Now, these confinement plates inside, this is the inside the tokamak reactor. It's a big donut, and here you can see the plasma all lit up. The temperatures in here are reaching 15 million degrees. This is and it's like way hotter than they say the core of the sun. The core of the sun's probably not as hot as the surface of the sun, but it's thousands of times hotter than the sun, basically. And so how do you confine that? It takes a lot of energy just to make that in the first place, and then how do you tap it out? So here's the model that's what's happening inside of there. And so they use magnetic confinement to keep this away, and you have to keep the plasma away from the walls, because even this plasma, I always say how the plasma has a mind of its own. It does what it wants to do, and part of our problems has been able to confine it and to control it. And the toroid has been in good shape, and there's some really interesting things. So when you look at some of the stats and what they're doing with this, it's just crazy the amount of energy and the amount of money that they put into it. So the energy that it's going to produce is going to be about 500 megawatts of thermal output power. But they have some better numbers on their site. This is just from Wikipedia in the end. But okay, so when it's going, they got to put 300 megawatts of power into it just to create the plasma and to contain the power, and it will produce 500 megawatts of thermal power. Now that's a heck of a lot of energy to put in just to get a little bit more out, right? Okay, so now they spend billions and billions of dollars. In 2015, they were at $14 billion, and they were already over their budget, and it's probably, who knows what it's at by now. I wasn't able to find any current numbers. But when you think about it, they're producing, so 500 minus 300, 200 megawatts of power for 1,000 seconds. So they're only for 15 minutes, they're going to get this 200 megawatts of power by putting in that much money and that much energy, and then they can only run it for 15 minutes. And so all this money and all this stuff has gone into that to just do that. And in the end, they admit it right here. They say they won't even use the power to do anything because it isn't going to break even. So they're not making enough power to even make it do anything. So there's a lot of people that have been concerned about this and how much money they're spending on these projects to do it. So I'm just trying to think of where it is, where they say the heat produced by ITER will not be used to generate any electricity because after accounting for the losses and the 300 megawatts minimum power input, the output will be equivalent to a zero net power reactor. So all that money and all that energy to make nothing. We'll see where it goes. The idea is that if we can figure it out, if we can master how to contain it and we can keep it running, it'll produce a lot of energy for a long time. But the reason why Pons and Fleischmann were, so ridiculed when they said, well, we can do these same fusion reactions without the thermal heat. And they went, no, that's just insane. That's not the way it works. There's massive amounts of energy being released, and you can't do it. So this is what became known as cold fusion. And there's a number of, ever since Pons and Fleischmann, there's been quite a few people all around the world in major corporations like Mitsubishi and Toyota and all these companies that you heard of, secretly working away on a lot of cold fusion processes. And when you go online and you start to look at a lot of the documentation that they've been producing, they're all doing it. They're all transmuting elements, they're all producing lots of energy, and so it's kind of a big battle between the hot fusion guys who've spent billions and billions of dollars and the poor garage people and now bigger companies producing cold fusion. But I think there's more hope for probably the cold fusion, or looking at being able to do fusion processes in a different way than what we're doing with the tokamak. And it's been done, and one of these things is really easy. I mean, there's some students who've followed this man's process. His name is Philo Farnsworth, and this is the Farnsworth fusion generator that he invented. And Farnsworth also invented the television set. The working model of the first television set. He was a big part of putting the key pieces together, as well as the tube that's in the cameras. Nowadays we use CCDs, but originally we used these tubes to capture images. So this man invented the television set, and he also invented a fusion reactor called the fusor. And quite an interesting story about him. Like, there's one of the quotes, I like this: the difficult things we do right away, but the impossible takes slightly longer. And there's still many people working on a fusor, and it's become quite a popular thing. Even high school students have been able to create these nuclear fusion reactors in their bedroom, and there's some fun YouTube videos where you see these young scientists working away, and they fire this thing up, and they got radiation detectors and things like this, and they run into the parents' bedroom and they're hiding behind the door and firing up a fusor reactor. So it can be done. You can build one yourself. I've always had it on my bucket list of things to do, but I haven't yet. But a funny, yeah. Well, what became of it? Now the fusor model is really interesting, and I'll show you in a second how it works. But there's newer ways of going on this model that I think have a lot of promise. The fusor is really good at producing neutrons. It can produce a boatload of a neutron emission from it, but nobody's found a practical way of extracting energy from it, if you will. So the inventor of the television set, I like this quote that he said to his son. He said, "Yeah, the television, there's nothing on it worthwhile, and we're not going to let you watch it in this household. And I don't want that in your intellectual diet." Because he was really dismayed when he saw what become of television. the whole thing went Orwellian, right away. So, so that's him with his original fusor reactor. And if you go online and you Google it, you can see how simple it is to build one of these things. And it uses this inertial electrostatic confinement to contain the plasma. So it's not using massive magnetic fields. It's kind of relying on the current that's being generated within this little sphere itself. So there's a lot of neat things, and you can see it's not going to cost you very much to build one of these, and you get it in a good vacuum. You need a high vacuum pump and high voltage power supply. So what the argument is in the fusion community is that we've been spending billions and billions of dollars on these big reactors to produce 1,000 seconds worth of power. This is going to be the most power we've ever got out of one of these things. But going back to what people like Farnsworth were doing with this, there may be some other concepts and different ways of going about it. And so as long as you have a really good vacuum chamber and high voltage power supply, you can build one at home too. So one of these concepts is this polywell trapping mechanism, because remember, it's all about confining and containing that plasma. So making these fields with these in a cubic-based toroidal magnetic confinement things, or electrostatic confinement in this case, to confine it. So there's a lot of ideas on the table about how to build a better fusor. And this is some of the magnetic confinement domains that you can see in the toroids, and then the center point, the center star. And this is really a key to a lot of the cold fusion process. When you look at Randall Mills and blacklight power and what these guys use, they show this little point of the star in the jar, the concentrated point of energy in their reactors. It's the same kind of concept of capturing that energy right in that space there. So that's on the other side of things, and I haven't been keeping up with the cold fusion because things are changing all the time. So I don't know if Roger, if you have any updates. What's Rossi up to?
Right? Andre Rossi ECAT, and in January next year he's going to be doing another presentation with his HotCat reactor.
Yeah.
So it hasn't, hit a brick wall. He's still continuing his research and development around it. So, we'll see.
Yeah.
And I'll probably send that link out because it's an experiment demonstration that you can watch online. So he's going to be doing it live from Florida at some stage in January, and I'll inform everybody through our Breakthru database.
Right. So something to look forward to in a month or so. So here's one of the diagrams going back to the devices, medical devices for the Lakhovsky multi-wave oscillator, and I mentioned Eric Dollard at the beginning. They're actually working on one now, which is pretty exciting, because when Eric looked at some of these drawings, when somebody had found one and they kind of reverse engineered it, he said, oh, there's a way better way of doing this. So they're making their own version of the multi-wave oscillator that's going to be coming out real soon. And that's going to be pretty exciting. Here's Eric working on the bench and standing with the classic lit up plasma tube in there and some of the early prototype designs. So look forward to that. And just want to end on a couple of different things. This is a quote from James Clerk Maxwell. And even when you talk to Max Planck and all these guys, they always said, Einstein made a few references to it. God doesn't play with dice and these kind of things. These guys all, when you get into a lot of these things, like Maxwell said, I've looked into the most philosophical systems, and I've seen that none will work without God, and a lot of these processes that people will look at over the years when you look at the how nature is and what there's an underlying pattern of a something behind it that seems to be creating creating this. So this whole idea of a creation concept, because when we look at the patterns and everything that we see in nature, it's just when you really get down to it, it's like it's some kind of divine thing, because all this we're trying to emulate with our algorithms and everything, and we looked at fractal algorithms and how we can recreate reality, virtual reality, and model trees and shorelines and plants and things with computers now, that computers are fast enough to do this. And there's an interesting theory that came out a while back that says, well, perhaps we are just actually running inside a computer, inside of a program somewhere, somehow, anyway. But I just want to end it on this one last video that I have from Russia, because you find the craziest things in some of these Russian YouTube videos and what these guys are doing. And this particular one deals with the torsion fields that we're talking about and anti-gravity, and how to basically build a flying anti-gravity craft. And so, it's hard to believe anything you see till you actually see it yourself. But what this young fellow does in Russia with this little device that he built in his garage or his living room is pretty interesting. So we'll just have a look at this, if it's going to work. I give you the sound, but it's all in Russian. But I'll just kind of cut to the good part. So if you look at what he's got here in this field, he's got a Tesla coil down here, a car battery, and a couple transformers, some high voltage transformers, and some wires running to this device here. And basically, I spent a lot of time analyzing these videos and what's going on, and he's slowly been giving out more information. But what he has in this thing here is 2 counter-rotating discs. So there's some DC motors on there. He's got a motor controller. He's got the high voltage transformer that puts a high voltage charge across the center plate. And then he's got 2 counter-rotating plates above and below it. And one of them has some neodymium magnets on it. And you can see his coil's fairly crude, running off a neon sign power supply or something like that. And so he's producing maybe 100,000 volts on there or something like that. And he can run the whole thing off a car battery. Here he explains it. And so recently somebody's translated what he's saying. You can find it online and get the interpretation. Just go to where he fires it up here. And that thing, it also has ultrasonic transducers above it and below it. And the key part that he talks about is the surface, rough surface on this disc is necessary, because it sort of emulates insect wings. And these guys all refer to, what's the fellow's name, the Rabinnikov. So he keeps referring back to Rabinnikov and how the rough surface on the plates of the spinning discs are really important. And so there are 2 counter-rotating fields, like we talked about with the Theraphi and the torsion fields. And what he does with this thing is pretty interesting. So he basically plugs it in, fires it up, one disc spinning clockwise on top, counterclockwise on the bottom. And that thing, it's crudely put together. It's not like a big thing. Now, I know it cuts to this video and people are all saying, well, it might not be real. But what he does with this thing is it's floating around, and you watch it, it seems pretty darn real.
sorry, does it have a sound? Does it rotate?
Yeah, you can hear it. He's talking during it, I think. Let me see.
Сейчас вам покажу, что там ничего нету.
But watch what he does with it. So he walks around it. It's not being suspended by any hidden strings going back or forth. You can see when he steps on the wires, it kind of drags it down. He picks up this big stick, waves it over top. There's nothing over top of it, hanging it up in the air. So I thought this is pretty good. And you can see how it's just kind of levitating there. And even with the wind blowing, what's really interesting, you look at the trees, you think it would be getting blown around by the wind, but it's kind of, but not. And then, so he even grabs onto the wires. One of them, which is a high voltage, maybe he's got a high voltage cable, silicone cable on there or something. Picks it up, floats it around. Stabilizes a bit so it doesn't go sideways. And lets it float.
А сейчас попробуем немножко перенастроить, чтобы повыше поднять. Минутку. Придется повозиться. Ну вот.
So then he goes back.
Взлет у меня в полном объеме не получился заснять, но посадку сейчас увидите.
And he's got it up quite high now.
Включить ТДКСник.
And then he cuts
Клемму с аккумулятора снимаем.
the power on it.
Здесь он здесь три разных питания. Отдельно на качер, отдельно на те диски, которые вращаются. А вот этот аккумулятор питает только ТДКС. Снимаем клемму. Сейчас диски размагнитятся.
В какой-то
секунде они упадут. В прошлом видео.
Maybe there's some big capacitors,
Не упало.
or the discs are still spinning, something.
Видите, более подробно. Сейчас на каком-то срыв будет.
Then bang, it drops out of the sky.
Все. Долбанулось.
Yeah.
Не знаю, повредился он или нет. Но только чисто из-за пожелания подписчиков. Хотели посадку. Взлет не получил.
So, yeah, his name here, if you Google it on YouTube, you'll find him. And he's got a few other Lexi Chekarov there. And he shows it in his living room and how he makes it and how he built it. And he says it takes a long time to get it in tune. Of course, all these things are all about resonance, and you really have to get them in tune before they do any magic. So, I don't know, it's pretty interesting and it's pretty cool, and it'd be really feasible to actually make something like that on a small scale, but you could easily, if he's lifting that much weight with that material, with those things, his biggest, heaviest thing is going to be that battery for the power supply, but you know, we have lighter batteries now. So interesting. When I find time, this is another one of my back burner projects that I want to build. But if you guys have a look and anybody does attempt to build one, let me know, because it's on my bucket list. So. But that pretty well sums up the talk for today. And is there any questions? Sure, comments.
What we have to do now is get the fuser working,
Yeah.
and the Russian guy's UFO working.
Right.
Put those together.
Put them
and
together.
we're all set.
Exactly. So there's a lot of stories.
As we go.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of stories in the UFO community. When you look at UFOs, they see plasma glowing around them, the strange lights. There's the typical common UFO that you've seen with the three balls on the bottom. Then they're glowing like plasma, so obviously there's some kind of energy source on there like that. And it can go on and on and on. So a lot of really neat stuff to come. And I mean, we are sort of on a tipping point in that sense where, and the internet's been a big part of this, for people to be able to share information like this, and so I think there's some exciting things to come in the near future with advancements. And what I really like about it is a lot of this technology is coming, instead of from the top down as it always traditionally been, from military technology that slowly boils down into your computer microchips and cell phones and things like this. Now we have the resources and the communities to be able to do things like this. So there's a lot of experimenters that are coming up with things in their garage and working on these kind of things that'll be coming out in the future. So a lot of this technology is coming from the bottom up now, which is fun. Yeah.
I wonder why he chose rough plates as opposed to something like gallium.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen that metal and I've been looking for it. You know, you used to have refrigerators from it, or mobile homes had it. It was like a corrugated, like a ripply aluminum pattern. It used to be quite popular, and I've been going around to metal shops trying to find it, and he's obviously just cut it out of some old piece of scrap metal that he had there. But that concept with the wings, he gets into a lot of, in his other videos, showing Grebennikov and all the concepts on how, you know, the ideas that you've heard that, you know, bumblebee can't really fly because its weight's bigger than what the wing thrust could create around the thing. So, but the idea is that they're creating an electrostatic field around them, which gives them sort of this type of energy. And you definitely see that when you watch bees go into a flower. It's not like they have to go in and pick up the pollen and grab it and stick it in their little sacs. When they get near it, you see the electrostatic attraction, and they all have these little fine hairs on it that you can tell they're highly charged. And when they go into the flower, the pollen just kind of rips off the flower and sticks to them, and then they just comb it down into their little pouches on their legs and fly off. So. But the point is that these electrostatic fields and the torsion fields have a big role to play that we've really just scratched the surface of. The Russians have done tons of research in these areas, and so it's a good place to look for some inspiration if you're interested in these kind of projects. So, yeah.
The last device was actually very reminiscent of the monopole generator that Tesla put together and actually turned into the electric meter.
Right, yeah.
So he's just got basically two of them going backwards.
Yeah, yeah.
Kind of like a gravity.
Right.
Essence.
Yeah. So, yeah, if you look at that thing like the Faraday motor, I think they call it, where the interesting thing about that is it produces high current and no voltage, whereas a lot of these things produce high voltage and no current. So it's very interesting to have that phenomenon of capturing the energy off a disk and having such huge currents but no voltage. It's like you kind of have to be able to combine the two worlds, right, to get real power. Yeah.
Yeah, another part of that I found out about is the current is converging towards the center, and that's usually not done.
Right.
And so Tom Bearden talks about things like that.
Yeah.
And also I think
It's
that
centripetal
was part of the
again.
Grill Society craft that they
Right.
built.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea of when the Russian technology that came out with the stories of the Nazi Bell and what they were doing, and they were using counter-rotating fuel with liquid metals, like you say, maybe gallium, or the idea is that they were using mercury that was treated somehow with the red mercury inside of these things, because there was a lot of, the Russians were just the Germans were stockpiling tons of mercury, and there's even U-boats that they caught filled with mercury that they were shipping. And rumor is there's a few of them that are sunk and they're sitting in the bottom of the ocean, filled with mercury with an iron cladding around the outside, slowly rusting away of, tons of mercury on board of them. So yeah. Yeah. They're waiting to happen, which we've created a lot of. We've dumped a ton of nuclear waste into the ocean. We've buried a lot of stuff improperly contained. One of my funny stories that I tell sometimes is they used to use gold to contain nuclear waste. So they'd line these 12 jars with gold and then bury them, and people dug them up to get the gold out of them. So they've dug up these vessels full of nuclear waste, dumped out the nuclear waste, melted down the gold, and the gold went into circulation and it's radioactive. And for a while there was a lot of watches and things like that you could put a Geiger counter on it. It was still radioactive because it got into the metal stream into the market. Yeah, crazy things humans do.
Have you heard of lattice-supported cold fusion?
Yeah. So the idea on the lattice is a lot of what Pons and Fleischmann, like what a lot of the cold fusion people were coming out with, because the idea is that you can get the deuterium to go into the metals. So the metals act like a sponge, and then inside the lattice, it works like a cage. It's sort of doing the confinement that fits in with like the polywell concept, the addition to the fusor itself. And that may be well what's happening. And then you get a little fusion process within the metal. So for the longest time, that was a big part of what everybody was trying to do, is just to loosen up the metals enough to get the support for the deuterium or whatever to get in there. And I think that's a big part of it, and you can loosen up the metals, but a lot of interesting things happen when you create the high potentials. So instead of using high current, using high voltage potentials, there's a lot of cold fusion processes that are being worked on that are based on that too. It's fun stuff. All right, well, thanks everybody for coming out, and you hang around, have some tea, have a chat. Hey.
Work and make a nigga wanna get his body so hot that can't go to sleep, don't wanna eat, pray to God that he